You know, Jesus starts talking about Pharisees and scribes in this passage. And I read a lot this week in preparation for this sermon today, and I learned a lot about the Pharisees. You know, the Pharisees really thought they were exceptional people. They were to be all to end all. And the word Pharisee literally means the separated ones. Now, William Barclay, in his new daily Bible study series, tells us that these were men who dedicated their whole life to the careful and meticulous observance of every rule and regulations which the scribes had carried out or worked out. There weren't very many of them. In fact, numbers tell us that there were not more than 6,000 of them at any one time. And the simple fact is that, you know, in order to accept the ability and to be able to carry out all of those regulations in the law, they wouldn't have time to do anything else. Consequently, they had to withdraw themselves, to separate themselves from an ordinary life in order to keep the law. Now, the Jewish people actually had lots of different, or described lots of different kinds of Pharisees. I found several different types. Let me share those with you. The first one was called the shoulder Pharisee. He was very meticulous in his observance of the law, and he wore his good deeds on his shoulder. He was out for a reputation of goodness and purity. And while he obeyed the law, he really just wanted to be noticed. And then there was one called the wait a little Pharisee. This is the one who could always produce an entirely valid excuse for putting off doing a good deed. He professed the creed of the strictest Pharisees, but he could always find an excuse for allowing his practice to lag behind a little bit. He spoke, but he never did. There's also the bruised and the bleeding Pharisee. Now, most of you remember that during this time, women were probably the most lowly people on the face of the earth, or in Israel at this time. And no self-respecting Orthodox teacher would be caught dead talking to a woman in public. I don't care if it was his wife or his sister. And some Pharisees would even take this a step further, and they would avoid even looking at women. So in order to avoid doing that, they would shut their eyes. They'd be walking down the street with their eyes closed, and they would bump into every wall or step or building that they came across. So naturally, they got bruised and wounded. And so this gave them a special reputation for their exceeding piety. The next Pharisee has several different names, or a variety of names. He's been called the pestle and mortar Pharisee, or the humpbacked Pharisee, or the tumbling Pharisee. These men walked in such ostentatious humility that they were bent over like a hunchback. They tried to be so humble that they wouldn't even lift their feet off the ground. And so they tripped over everything they came across. So their humility became a self-advertising ostentation. Now, consider the ever-reckoning or compounding Pharisee. This Pharisee was forever racking up all of his good deeds. He kept a balance sheet, and on one side was God, and on one side was himself. And he believed that for every good deed that he did, he put God a little further into his debt. So, to this Pharisee, religion was always about profit and loss. The sixth one was the timid or fearing Pharisee. He was always in dread of divine punishment. As a result, he was always wiping the chalice or the tray so that he might seem to be good. And he saw religion in terms of judgment and life in terms of evasion of judgment. And finally, there was the God-fearing Pharisee. These Pharisees were few and far between, but he was the one who really and truly loved God, and who found his delight in observing the law of God, however difficult it might be. as you can imagine, the Pharisees loved to go to the marketplace. They loved to be seen, and they loved to be recognized, and they loved to be called out to at that point in time. They had the best seat in the synagogue. They sat at Moses' seat. They were dressed as wise teachers of the law. And they had these things that they didn't necessarily wear on a Sabbath day or a special day, but they were called phylacteries. And what that is just a leather box. And they wore one on their wrist and then one on their forehead. Now the one on the wrist had just one compartment. And in that compartment it had rolled up parchment. And on the parchment were 4 Bible verses. 2 from Exodus and 2 from Deuteronomy. And the one on the forehead actually had 4 smaller compartments with one of those same passages in each of the compartments. The thing about that was, though, they wore these with great honor, but instead of making one of normal size, they had broad straps of leather so that they were very clearly seen, so that they would be able to demonstrate their exemplary obedience and their piety. In Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 to 41, and in Deuteronomy chapter 22:12, God commanded his people to make fringes on the borders of their garments, so that when they looked down on them, they could see those fringes and they might remember the commandments of God. Those Pharisees, you might say they were at the height of arrogance. They were flying high. They were really completely out of touch with the people. And Jesus didn't like the way we've been able to see throughout the Bible. He tells us, though, in verses 2 and 3, that we should do whatever they teach us, but we should not do as they do, for they don't practice what they teach. He tells us that the scribes and Pharisees are basically hypocrites. They're people who talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They tie up heavy burdens, they place them on the shoulders of others, and they are unwilling to lift a finger to help move them, or to help those people. They believed they were exceptional men, and it was their duty to offer the people the gift of moral clarity. But as for practicing charity, well, that was just left up to other people. It didn't belong to them. That wasn't their job. But Jesus goes on to tell us, or recommend to us, humility, that our life might contain humility. In verse 8, he tells us that we are not called to be a rabbi, which literally means one great one. For you have one teacher, and we're all students. And then in verse 10, he says, nor are you to be called instructors, because we have only one instructor, the Messiah. Now, as the crowds were listening and his disciples were listening, if they weren't surprised at what Jesus had said already, when he got to the last part of this passage, they were probably astounded, because he basically turned upside down the whole social structure. He sent those arrogant Pharisees, those exemplary people, down to the bottom in the basement, and he brought those of us who are servants upstairs to a penthouse suite. He gave us that place. The greatest among you will be your servant, he predicted, and all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, does that mean that exceptional people have nothing to offer? No, certainly not. He knows that the scribes and Pharisees have extensive knowledge of the law. So he tells us that we should do whatever they teach us.